Chapter 2. Eric Eliodam opened his eyes with a sudden quick breath. He hated that dream, even though he seemed to have it every night. His nostrils immediately curled up as the smell of rotten food, dung, dirt, and stale water hit his nose. He rubbed his face hard and sat up, leaning against the alleyway wall of the Red Lady. Bethel and Brian slept, curled up under tattered blankets, bent arms used as pillows. The stars speckled overhead, at least what he could see of them past the 3- and 4-storied buildings. He wanted to poke them as if they were bubbles floating in a gently churning stream. He smiled. What a childish thing to think. A hacking, phlegm-filled cough from further down the alley echoed off the walls. He hated the others that slept in this alley. They drank and hoarded all their money away, and they always stared, looking to take what wasn't theirs. When on his own, Eric had chased away more than a few vagrants, emboldened by the absence of Bethel and Brian. At night, they looked like shadowy ghosts, lumbering from wall to wall, stumbling over trash and other bodies. Eric felt something on his foot. The scratching sound against his boot and the tiny squeak told him it was a western rat. White rats, his father called them, and he kicked out. The tiny squeak gave pretense to the rodent size, as the cat-sized creature flew into a wooden cart across the alleyway. They seemed indestructible, and this one, not as big as they could get, regained its feet quickly and hissed at Eric. He wanted to kick it again, stab it with his knife, but knew better. A bite from a western rat often carried disease, deadly disease. It finally scurried away. "I prefer the lumberyard to this," Eric said, leaning his head back against the wall. "By heaven, I prefer the pigsties of Venton to this. Pig slop was better eating." He rubbed his stomach as it grumbled. "How much longer?" he quietly asked himself. His brother Bethel groaned. "Go to sleep, Eric." Eric lay back down, resting his head against a sack of old rags a cook from the Red Lady had thrown away. "Will they never stop?" Eric muttered, as he washed yet another dirty dish in the rear kitchen of the Wicked Beard Tavern. "What?" Bethel asked. "The dishes, the glasses, the platters and cutting boards and knives," Eric replied, his irritation clear. "Will they never stop?" "Not as long as people eat and drink and cook," Brian, Eric's cousin, replied. Eric looked at a stack of dishes that seemed shoulder-high, a myriad of food caked to each plate. He shook his head. "This can't be any better than farming." "Which would you prefer?" Bethel asked. "An endless supply of dirty dishes that we know we won't have to wash one day, or an endless supply of weeds that we would have to pull for the rest of our lives?" "Weeds," Eric replied. "Of course you would prefer the weeds," Bethel said. "Of course you would prefer the weeds," Bethel said. "You actually liked farming." "At least they were our weeds," Eric said, "and not someone else's filth." A boy, at least 3 summers younger than Eric, walked in and dumped at least 24 more dishes into the wash bin next to where the 3 Eliodams worked. "Bill says he needs these right away," the boy said, with too much joy in his voice. "Thanks," Eric grumbled, as the boy skipped away. "Do you think this was his job?" "What?" Bethel asked. "Do you think this was that little pipsqueak's job, washing dishes, before we came along?" "Who cares?" Brian groaned. "I think it was," Eric said, "and that's why he's always so happy when he drops off more, because he doesn't have to do them." "Will you shut up?" Brian yelled, throwing a scrubbing brush into the water right in front of Eric. The water splashed up into Eric's face, and he could taste the stale beer and old meat that had mixed with soap. He spat on the floor. "Damn it, Brian," Eric said, wiping a dry part of his shirt sleeve across his face before he splashed a bit of water at Brian. It was enough to sprinkle his cousin's shirt, but not enough to soak it, even though it was already fairly wet. He wanted to irritate Brian, not start a fight. Brian shot his cousin a dirty look, but Eric shrugged it off. He had seen so many of those looks, especially in the last 2 years, that he knew it meant little more than annoyance. "You said these dishes will eventually end," Eric said. "When?" Soon, Bethel replied. You've said that before, Brian added. This spring will be our second one in Waterton, Eric said. When are we supposed to make our way east? There's a mining camp, Bethel said. A new one, just east of the Southland Gap. I say we go there as soon as possible. What do we know about mining? Eric asked. Nothing, but it's a step in the right direction, Bethel replied, with a hint of chastisement. A stepping stone to get east, that's all. I'm tired of your damn stepping stones, Brian yelled. Venton was a stepping stone. The lumberyard was a stepping stone. Waterton was a stepping stone. And here we are, washing dishes and cleaning shit from the privies and penniless. Oi! Bill was a small man, but he had a big voice, and it echoed through the kitchen when he raised it. You lot shut your stupid bloody mouths and get to washing, or you can forget dinner. All three dropped their heads as if Bill's voice was a thrown stone, and they needed to duck. You know, Brian's right, Eric began. You have no right to speak on the matter, Brian interrupted, pointing a wet, accusatory finger at Eric. You're half the reason we're here, in this dung heap, and not east, living the life. What are you talking about? Eric asked. But he knew what Brian was going to say. He had said it too many times to count. Bethel and I wanted to leave, Brian hissed. We hated the farm. We hated living among idealistic fools. I don't know about hate, Bethel had started to say, but Brian held up a hand, cutting him off. Oh, be quiet, Brian snarled. And then he stared at Eric. And I couldn't handle being around my stupid, drunken father for one more moment. And then you come along with some fool idea about saving your father's farm and ruin everything. I still don't know how I ruined everything, Eric muttered. When Brian had first derided him about his coming along, it hurt Eric deeply. He looked up to Brian, in a way almost like he did Bethel, like any younger cousin might look up to their older cousin. But he had heard this speech so many times, it had lost its effect. We had saved up enough to get east, Brian spat, no longer looking at Eric, but aggressively washing dishes while he spoke. We had enough money. We had a plan. But one more person meant we needed more coin. And then there's your fool brother, trying to cover your ass at every turn and sticking up for you. Damn it. Brian shook his head and continued to mumble and curse under his breath. Don't pay him any attention, Bethel whispered. I never do, Eric replied. Eric leaned up against the back wall of the wicked beard and finished off the spiced wine that was now cold and flat. The beef had been tough and the carrots and peppers a little burnt, but it had been food in his belly, and he was glad for it. His brother snored, a plate of half-eaten food resting by his head, and a trio of white rats waiting to feast on whatever was left over. Eric hissed at the rats, and they simply hissed back. Damn rats, Eric muttered. Brian had left a while ago, eating his food quickly and cursing about it the whole time. Eric shook his head. Stale beer and whores, he said quietly. We're supposed to be saving our money, and that's all you spend your coin on. Stale beer and whores. As if that can make you forget home and your father. Eric looked at the three rats. They had built up enough courage to inch closer. Was home really that bad? Eric asked the rats. They just hissed again. I liked home. The farm. So why did I leave? I don't know. To make a fortune and save my family's land? Stupid. Eric shrugged, and the rats hissed again as he turned his eyes to the sky and his constants, the stars. He remembered a night like this one, cool and crisp and clear, as he sat behind his father's barn, watching the moon and the stars. It was the night his father, the ever-respected Rickard Eliodum, had returned from Bull's Run, the second largest city in Hamon, and the choice marketplace for farmers from northern Hathgolfane. His father had returned just before darkness fell, and from the shadows of the barn, Eric had watched him, just sitting in the wagon, turning his straw hat over repeatedly in his hands. His mother had finally walked out the front door of their house and greeted her husband as he stepped down from the wagon. Eric's mother rested her head on her husband's chest and asked that fated question, "Was the market good to us?" Eric shook his head. His mother might as well have asked, "Are our lives ever going to be the same again?" Or, "What day will both my boys be leaving?" Or, "When should I start uncontrollably crying and screaming as my boys turn their backs on me?" That was when Eric's father went on a tirade of curses and ridicules of the Harmonian market, much to the chagrin and chastisement of Eric's mother. His father complained about the crops that Harmonian nobles grew and the prices they received for vegetables and fruits and meat that was half as good. He moaned about the encroachment on the free lands of the north by the feudal lords from Harmon. He spoke in hushed tones of another farmer who had already been removed from his land. He said they would soon be coming for their lands, Eliodom land. "And if they come?" Karita Eliodom had asked. "We fight them," Ricard had replied. "Damn dreams," Eric muttered. He sighed and shook his head to try and shut out any thought of what increasingly plagued his sleep. Instead, he watched the stars, always constant, always the same. A season might change their position or the time of the night, but they were always there. Now he thought of the last words he'd heard his father say that evening. "The world is changing, Karita. We can only hope the Creator will have mercy on us."